Tonight we journey to a farmhouse in rural Rhode Island where one family's dream home became their decade-long nightmare, leading to one of the most famous paranormal investigations in American history. But was it truly supernatural, or something else entirely lurking in those old wooden walls? Let me take you back to January 1971, when the world felt simpler and quieter. Bell-bottom jeans were the height of fashion, Nixon was president, and families still believed they could find peace in the countryside. Roger and Carolyn Perron thought they had found exactly that kind of peace when they discovered a sprawling farmhouse in Harrisville, Rhode Island. The house sat on 200 acres of rolling farmland, a white colonial structure that had weathered nearly 2 centuries of New England seasons. With 5 daughters ranging in age from 5 to 12, Andrea, Nancy, Christine, Cindy, and April, the Perrons needed space, and this place offered it in abundance. 14 rooms spread across 2 floors, with a basement that seemed to stretch endlessly into darkness beneath the foundation. Roger worked as a traveling salesman, which meant long stretches away from home. Carolyn would be alone with the girls most of the time, but that didn't concern her. She was a practical woman, raised on a farm herself, comfortable with isolation and self-reliance. The house needed work, the kind of endless projects that old homes demand. But it had character, charm even. Unfortunately, character in old houses sometimes comes with more than creaking floorboards and drafty windows. The moving truck arrived on a gray, winter morning, and the family began the familiar ritual of making a new place feel like home. The girls chose their rooms, Carolyn planned where furniture would go, and Roger inspected the property with the satisfaction of a man who believed he'd made a sound investment. The previous owners, elderly siblings who had lived there their entire lives, had left quickly and quietly, taking little more than their personal belongings. Strange, Carolyn would later remember thinking. They left behind so many things: furniture, dishes, even photographs on the walls. But people have their reasons, and the Perrons were grateful for anything that made the transition easier. The girls were excited about their new rooms, the vast yard where they could play, and the adventures waiting in the surrounding woods. For the first few weeks, everything seemed perfectly normal. Well, mostly normal. There were small things, the kind of oddities you'd expect in any old house adjusting to new occupants. Doors that seemed to stick, then suddenly swing open. Floorboards that groaned in specific patterns, almost like footsteps. The heating system made unusual sounds, clicks and whispers that echoed through the walls at night. Carolyn noticed that certain rooms felt colder than others, even when the heating was working properly. The basement, in particular, had an atmosphere that made her uncomfortable. Not exactly frightening, but unwelcoming, as if she were intruding somewhere she didn't belong. The family dog, a gentle golden retriever named Sadie, refused to enter the house entirely. She would approach the front porch, then stop abruptly, hackles raised, whimpering. No amount of coaxing could convince her to cross the threshold. This was unusual for Sadie, who had always been an indoor dog, content to sleep by the fireplace in their previous home. Maybe she just needs time to adjust, Roger suggested, though privately he found the dog's behavior puzzling. But Sadie never did adjust. She spent the entire time the family lived in that house sleeping in the barn, regardless of weather or season, as if some invisible barrier prevented her from entering the human living space. The children, however, seemed to adapt quickly. They explored every corner of their new home, from the spacious attic to the mysterious cellar, treating it like an enormous playground. Children, after all, are remarkably resilient creatures, capable of making themselves comfortable almost anywhere. Yet even they began to notice certain peculiarities. Little April, the youngest at 5 years old, started talking about her new friend who visited her room at night. When Carolyn asked about this friend, April would describe a young boy who stood quietly in the corner, watching her sleep. He never spoke, she explained, but he seemed sad, and she felt sorry for him. "What does he look like?" Carolyn asked, expecting the usual vague descriptions children give when discussing imaginary friends. "He's pale," April said matter-of-factly. "And his clothes are old, like from a long time ago. Sometimes he's not there when I wake up, but I can tell he was watching." Carolyn felt a chill that had nothing to do with the house's drafty windows. Children often created imaginary companions, especially during times of change and adjustment. But something about April's description, the calm, detailed way she spoke about this nocturnal visitor, felt different from typical childhood fantasy. The other girls began reporting their own experiences. Nancy, aged 10, mentioned hearing children's laughter coming from empty rooms. Christine complained that someone was moving her belongings while she slept, rearranging books and toys in patterns she hadn't created. Andrea, the eldest at 12, started having difficulty sleeping, claiming that footsteps in the hallway kept her awake. "It's probably just the house settling," Carolyn told herself, repeating the explanation like a mantra. "Old houses make noise. The girls are adjusting to a new environment. Everything will be fine once we've been here longer." But privately, she was beginning to notice things herself. Things that were harder to explain away with logic and common sense. The broom, for instance, had developed a habit of disappearing. Carolyn would leave it in the kitchen closet, return an hour later, and find it missing entirely. She'd search the house, eventually discovering it in the most unlikely places, standing upright in the middle of the living room, leaning against a wall in the upstairs hallway, or propped in a corner of the basement as if someone had been using it and simply abandoned it there. "Did one of you girls move the broom?" she'd ask at dinner. 5 heads would shake in unison, their faces innocent and confused. The smells were another concern entirely. Occasionally, usually in the early morning hours, a scent would drift through certain rooms that could only be described as rotting flesh. Not subtle or faint, but overwhelmingly strong. The kind of smell that made you cover your nose and mouth while searching desperately for the source. Carolyn would inspect every inch of the affected areas, looking for dead mice in the walls, checking for problems with the plumbing, even examining the basement for any sign of decay. She never found anything that could explain the odor, which would disappear as suddenly as it had arrived, leaving behind only the normal smells of an old house: wood polish, dust, and the faint mustiness of age. Perhaps most disturbing were the bruises that began appearing on Carolyn's body. She would wake in the morning to find dark marks on her arms and legs, perfectly formed fingerprints and grip marks that she couldn't remember acquiring. When Roger noticed them, he was concerned enough to suggest she see a doctor. "I'm not sleepwalking," she insisted. "I'm not hurting myself. I have no idea where these are coming from." The doctor found nothing wrong with her health, no underlying conditions that might cause spontaneous bruising. He suggested she might be bumping into furniture in the dark, perhaps during trips to check on the children at night. It was a reasonable explanation, the kind that medical professionals offer when faced with symptoms that don't fit standard diagnoses. But Carolyn knew her own body, knew her own movements. These marks appeared in places where furniture couldn't reach, in patterns that suggested deliberate contact rather than accidental collision. Winter deepened around the farmhouse, and with it, the strange occurrences seemed to intensify. The family developed routines around the unexplained phenomena, the way people adapt to living with any persistent problem. They learned which rooms felt particularly cold and dressed accordingly. They accepted that certain sounds would echo through the house at night and tried not to let it disturb their sleep. But adaptation only goes so far when dealing with the truly inexplicable. And what the Perron family was about to discover was that their farmhouse held secrets far darker than missing brooms and mysterious bruises. Secrets that reached back through decades of tragedy, connecting their present troubles to a past they could never have imagined. Spring arrived early that year, melting the last stubborn patches of snow and revealing the farmhouse property in all its rustic glory. For Carolyn, the warmer weather meant she could finally explore the land properly, walking the fence lines and discovering the remnants of old outbuildings scattered across the acreage. It was during one of these explorations that she made her first real discovery about the house's past. Behind the main structure, partially hidden by overgrown brambles, stood the remains of what had once been a substantial barn. The roof had long since collapsed, but the stone foundation remained intact, along with portions of the wooden frame that spoke of skilled craftsmanship from an earlier era. More intriguing were the smaller structures she found: root cellars, a smokehouse, and what appeared to be the foundation of a much older dwelling. This wasn't simply a farmhouse with some history. This was land that had been continuously inhabited for generations, each family leaving their mark before moving on, or in some cases, perhaps, before being forced to leave. Carolyn began asking questions in town, the way newcomers do when they want to understand their new community. The responses she received were interesting. Shop owners and neighbors were friendly enough, but conversations about the farmhouse had a tendency to grow quiet, with people suddenly remembering urgent tasks that required their immediate attention. "Oh, you bought the old Sherman place," Mrs. Hartwell at the general store said, her smile faltering slightly. "Well, that's quite a project you've taken on." When Carolyn pressed for details about previous owners or the property's history, Mrs. Hartwell became busy rearranging canned goods, suggesting that perhaps the Historical Society might have more information. The Historical Society, unfortunately, seemed to have very little information about that particular property, which was odd considering how long it had clearly been inhabited. It was Roger who finally learned something useful, though he almost wished he hadn't. During one of his trips home from a sales route, he stopped at a tavern in a neighboring town for dinner. The bartender, after a few drinks and some casual conversation, proved more talkative than the residents of Harrisville had been. "Sherman Place, eh?" the man said, wiping down glasses with practiced efficiency. "Haven't heard anyone mention that land in years. Your family must be braver than most." "Braver?" Roger asked, though he was beginning to suspect he didn't want to know the answer. The bartender glanced around the nearly empty tavern, then leaned closer. "That land's got a reputation. Has for decades. Some say it's cursed, though I don't put much stock in such things myself." He told Roger what the locals remembered. Stories passed down through generations about strange deaths, unexplained accidents, and families who fled the property in the middle of the night, leaving behind their possessions and never returning to claim them. "The Sherman woman," the bartender continued, his voice dropping lower. "She's the one they blame for most of it. Lived there back in the 1800s. Folks said she practiced witchcraft, that she made some kind of pact to keep the land in her family forever." Roger felt a chill that had nothing to do with the tavern's air conditioning. "What happened to her?" "Died on the property, they say. Hanged herself from a tree behind the house, rather than face the accusations in town. But the story goes that she cursed anyone who would try to claim her land." The bartender straightened up, suddenly seeming to realize how his words might sound to a man who had just moved his family onto that very property. "Of course, that's just old stories. Superstition. I'm sure you folks will be just fine." But his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced of that himself. Roger drove home that night with considerably more on his mind than usual. He debated whether to share what he'd learned with Carolyn, ultimately deciding that she had enough to worry about without adding century-old ghost stories to her concerns. Unfortunately, Carolyn was conducting her own research. The town library, small but surprisingly well-maintained, housed a collection of local records dating back to the area's earliest settlement. Carolyn spent several afternoons there, ostensibly researching the property's agricultural history but actually searching for any information about previous residents. What she found was disturbing. The records showed a pattern of short-term ownership stretching back decades. Families would purchase the property, live there for a few years, then sell suddenly and leave the area entirely. In several cases, the departures seemed to coincide with unexplained deaths or accidents involving family members. The Sherman family had owned the land longer than anyone else. nearly 40 years in the mid-1800s. But their tenure had ended abruptly in 1885, when ownership transferred to the bank following what the records cryptically described as family difficulties. Bathsheba Sherman's name appeared frequently in these records, usually in connection with legal disputes over property boundaries or accusations of theft from neighboring farms. She seemed to have been a woman who made enemies easily, someone who generated conflict wherever she went. More troubling were the newspaper clippings from that era, which Carolyn found filed away in a folder marked Local History, Miscellaneous. Several articles mentioned investigations into infant deaths in the area, with Bathsheba's name surfacing repeatedly as a person of interest. The articles were written in the careful language of 19th century journalism, avoiding direct accusations while making their implications clear. Children in families that crossed Bathsheba Sherman had a disturbing tendency to die suddenly and unexpectedly, usually from causes that baffled the local doctor. One article, dated March 1885, was particularly chilling. The death of young Thomas Kenyon, aged 8 months, marks the 7th such tragedy to befall families in the Harrisville district over the past 2 years. Dr. Fielding reports that the child showed no signs of illness or distress before his sudden passing. The boy's parents, Samuel and Mary Kenyon, had recently engaged in a legal dispute with their neighbor, Mrs. Bathsheba Sherman, over the placement of fence lines between their properties. Another clipping, this one from April of the same year, described the discovery of Bathsheba's body. Mrs. Bathsheba Sherman, 73, was found deceased on her property yesterday morning by neighbors who had grown concerned when she failed to appear in town for several days. The body was discovered hanging from an oak tree behind the family dwelling. Deputy Marshal Hawkins has ruled the death a suicide, though he notes certain unusual circumstances that he declined to detail for this publication. Carolyn read these articles 3 times, feeling increasingly unsettled. She tried to dismiss them as the kind of tragic coincidences that occurred in any small community, the sort of events that grew larger in memory and folklore than they had been in reality. But she couldn't shake the feeling that these old tragedies were somehow connected to what her family was experiencing now. That evening, she decided to share her discoveries with Roger, despite her reluctance to add to their worries. They sat in the kitchen after the girls had gone to bed, spreading the photocopied newspaper articles across the table like pieces of a puzzle they weren't sure they wanted to solve. "Maybe we should talk to the girls about this," Carolyn suggested. "Prepare them for the possibility that some of what they're experiencing might be connected to the house's history." Roger was less convinced. What would we tell them? That a woman who died 90 years ago might be haunting our home. That's either going to terrify them or encourage them to imagine more than they're already seeing. It was a reasonable concern. The fine line between preparing children for unusual circumstances and creating unnecessary fear was difficult to navigate, especially when the parents themselves weren't sure what they were dealing with. But as it turned out, the decision was made for them. The next morning, little April came downstairs for breakfast with news that changed everything. "My friend told me his name last night," she announced, settling into her chair with the matter-of-fact tone that children use when discussing the most extraordinary events. Carolyn felt her stomach tighten. "Oh? What did he say?" "He said his name is Johnny, and he's been waiting here for a very long time. He said the lady doesn't like it when families try to live in her house." The kitchen fell silent except for the tick of the old clock on the wall. "What lady, sweetheart?" Carolyn asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. April looked up from her cereal with serious 5-year-old eyes. "The angry lady. Johnny says she doesn't want us here and she's going to try to make us leave like she made the other families leave." She paused, then added with the devastating innocence of childhood, "But Johnny likes us, so he's trying to protect us from her. He says we should be very careful, especially Mommy, because the angry lady doesn't like mommies the most." Carolyn and Roger exchanged a look across the breakfast table that contained volumes of unspoken communication. Their youngest daughter had just described with remarkable accuracy, the central elements of the historical pattern they had discovered in their research. And somehow, a 5-year-old child had learned things about their house's past that weren't written in any book or newspaper article they had found. Things were about to get considerably more complicated in the old Sherman farmhouse. But before we explore how the family dealt with these revelations, we need to understand exactly who Bathsheba Sherman had been in life, and why her presence seemed to linger so powerfully in death. That story takes us deeper into the dark history of the land the Perrons now called home. Bathsheba Thayer was born in 1812 to a family of modest farmers in the rural outskirts of what would become Harrisville, in an era when women were expected to be quiet, compliant, and devoted to domestic duties. Bathsheba stood out for all the wrong reasons. Even as a child, she possessed what the local minister diplomatically described as a willful spirit. Her teachers found her difficult to manage, prone to outbursts of temper that seemed disproportionate to whatever minor infractions had triggered them. Other children avoided her, not from any specific fear, but from an instinctive sense that Bathsheba was somehow different from them. Unfortunately, being different in a small 19th century farming community was rarely considered an advantage. At 18, she married Judson Sherman, a man 12 years her senior who owned a substantial tract of farmland that had been in his family for 2 generations. It should have been a good match. Bathsheba gaining security and social standing, Judson acquiring a young wife to help manage his household and bear his children. But those who knew them both suspected the marriage was more strategic than romantic. Judson needed help running his property, and Bathsheba needed escape from her increasingly strained relationship with her own family. Love, if it had ever existed between them, seemed to evaporate quickly under the pressures of daily life. The Sherman farm was prosperous by local standards, with fertile fields that produced reliable crops and enough livestock to generate steady income. But prosperity meant little if you couldn't enjoy it, and the Shermans' neighbors began to notice that their success came with an unusual cost. Bathsheba proved to be a demanding and suspicious woman, quick to take offense at perceived slights and slower to forgive than the small community's social fabric could comfortably accommodate. She accused neighbors of stealing from her garden, moving her property markers, and allowing their animals to damage her crops. Most of these accusations were probably legitimate. Farms in those days were closely packed, and boundary disputes were common. But Bathsheba pursued every grievance with the intensity that seemed excessive. More troubling was her relationship with the hired help. Farm workers who crossed her, even in minor ways, had a disturbing tendency to suffer accidents. A man who complained about his wages fell from a ladder and broke his leg. A woman who questioned Bathsheba's household management developed a mysterious illness that left her bedridden for weeks. A boy who was caught stealing apples from the orchard was found the next morning with severe burns on his hands, though no one could explain how he had acquired them. These incidents might have been dismissed as coincidence if they hadn't occurred with such remarkable frequency. The Sherman farm gained a reputation as an unlucky place to work, and Bathsheba found it increasingly difficult to find reliable help. The situation grew worse after Bathsheba's first pregnancy ended in miscarriage, then her second, and her third. In an era when infant mortality was tragically common, losing children wasn't unusual, but Bathsheba's repeated losses seemed to transform whatever had been merely difficult about her personality into something genuinely dark. She became obsessed with the idea that her neighbors were somehow responsible for her troubles. The woman next door who had given birth to healthy twins must have stolen Bathsheba's good fortune. The family down the road with their thriving children had clearly made some sort of pact at her expense. These weren't the rational grievances of a woman dealing with tragedy. They were the twisted accusations of someone whose grief had curdled into something more dangerous. Local records from this period, preserved in the Historical Society's archives, paint a picture of escalating conflict. Bathsheba filed formal complaints against virtually every family within a mile of her property, accusing them of theft, trespassing, vandalism, and various forms of harassment. The local magistrate grew weary of adjudicating disputes that seemed to spring more from Bathsheba's imagination than from actual wrongdoing. But it was the children who suffered most from Bathsheba's growing instability. Beginning in the late 1860s, families in the immediate area began experiencing what could only be described as a plague of infant deaths. Healthy babies would sicken suddenly and die within days, despite the best efforts of the local doctor. Children who had been thriving would develop mysterious ailments that proved resistant to all treatment taught. The pattern was subtle at first. Childhood mortality was high in that era, and isolated deaths could easily be attributed to the various diseases that swept through rural communities. But as the incidents accumulated, a disturbing pattern emerged. The families who lost children were invariably those who had recently crossed Bathsheba Sherman in some way. A property dispute, a disagreement over livestock, a complaint about her behavior. These minor conflicts seemed to precede each tragedy with remarkable consistency. Dr. Edmund Fielding, the area's only physician, began keeping detailed notes about these cases. His journal, discovered decades later, reveals a man struggling to understand a medical mystery that defied explanation. The children showed no signs of conventional illness. They simply faded. They would become listless, refuse food, and slip away, despite appearing physically healthy. "I have attended the deaths of 7 children in this district over the past 18 months, Dr. Fielding wrote in 1884. In each case, the symptoms were identical and the outcome inevitable. Yet, I can find no medical explanation for their decline. It is as if some malign influence has settled over these families, draining the life from their young ones." The doctor never directly accused Bathsheba Sherman, but his notes make clear that he had begun to notice the correlation between family conflicts with her and subsequent childhood deaths. He even went so far as to recommend that one family relocate to avoid what he cryptically referred to as the persistent environmental factors affecting child mortality in this vicinity. The community's suspicions finally crystallized in 1885, when 8-month-old Thomas Kenyon died just days after his parents had filed a formal complaint about Bathsheba's interference with their property boundaries. The boy had been healthy and normal until the morning he was found dead in his cradle, with no sign of illness or distress. That evening, a group of local men visited the Sherman farm to demand answers. They found Bathsheba alone. Judson had died 3 years earlier, reportedly of a heart attack, though some whispered that his wife's constant conflicts had literally worried him to death. The confrontation, according to witness accounts recorded years later, was heated but not violent. The men accused Bathsheba of practicing witchcraft, of making some sort of supernatural pact that allowed her to harm their children. She denied everything, but her denials were delivered with a venom that convinced no one of her innocence. "You have no proof," she told them, standing in her doorway like a queen defending her castle. "You accuse me because you need someone to blame for your own failures as fathers and protectors." Then, with the kind of dramatic flourish that would be remembered and repeated for generations, she allegedly said, "This land is mine, and it will remain mine. Anyone who tries to take it from me will discover that some prices are higher than they are willing to pay." The men left that night feeling unsatisfied and somehow diminished, as if Bathsheba's mere presence had drained something essential from them. They had come seeking justice, or at least answers, but they had encountered something they didn't understand and couldn't combat with conventional means. 3 days later, Bathsheba Sherman was found hanging from the large oak tree behind her house. The discovery was made by her nearest neighbor, a woman named Sarah Mills, who had come to borrow flour and grown concerned when no one answered her knock. Sarah found the kitchen door unlocked and called out, receiving no response. A search of the house revealed nothing unusual. Breakfast dishes still on the table, a fire still burning in the hearth, no signs of struggle or distress. It was only when Sarah stepped into the backyard that she saw the body swaying gently in the morning breeze. Deputy Marshal Hawkins, called to investigate, found the scene disturbing in ways he struggled to articulate in his official report. Bathsheba had apparently climbed the tree and secured the rope around a high branch before jumping, but the branch she had chosen was barely strong enough to support her weight. It seemed an oddly uncertain method for someone determined to end her life. More puzzling were the scratches on the tree trunk, deep gouges in the bark that suggested a struggle, as if Bathsheba had tried to climb back up after the rope tightened around her neck. Yet the rope itself showed no signs of having been cut or frayed, and there was no ladder or stool beneath the tree that would have allowed her to escape once she had committed herself to the act. The deputy's private notes, discovered in his family's papers decades later, revealed additional details that never made it into the official report. Bathsheba's fingernails were torn and bloody, consistent with desperate scratching at something. Her face was twisted into an expression of rage rather than the peaceful resignation typically seen in suicide victims. Most disturbing of all, her eyes remained open, staring directly at the house with what the deputy described as malevolent awareness. Perhaps most significantly, the deputy noted that the tree from which Bathsheba had hanged herself was the same oak that stood directly behind what would later become the Perron family's farmhouse. The same tree whose branches now scraped against the roof during winter storms, producing the scratching sounds that kept the children awake at night. With Bathsheba's death, the pattern of childhood mortality in the area ceased as abruptly as it had begun. Families who had been planning to relocate decided to stay. The local doctor's journal returned to recording the ordinary ailments and injuries of rural life, with no further mention of mysterious childhood deaths. But the Sherman property itself seemed to absorb and hold on to the darkness that had surrounded its final owner. In the years following Bathsheba's suicide, the land changed hands repeatedly, with each new family staying only long enough to experience what the locals euphemistically called difficulties before moving on. Some left because of financial problems that arose suddenly and inexplicably. Others departed after experiencing what they described as persistent bad luck, accidents, illnesses, and misfortunes that seemed to target them specifically. A few families fled in the middle of the night, leaving behind their possessions and refusing to explain their departure to anyone. By the 1960s, the property had gained such a reputation that real estate agents had difficulty finding buyers, even at significantly reduced prices. The house would sit empty for months at a time, slowly deteriorating while the land around it grew wild and unkempt. When the elderly siblings who owned it prior to the Perrons finally decided to sell, they did so with obvious relief, accepting the first reasonable offer they received without negotiation. They moved to Florida immediately after the sale, telling their neighbors only that they were ready for a change of scenery. And so the Sherman farmhouse came to the Perron family, carrying with it nearly a century of tragedy, conflict, and unanswered questions. The new owners knew nothing of this history when they signed the papers and collected the keys. But history, as they were about to discover, has a way of making itself known whether you're prepared for it or not, especially when that history involves a woman who had sworn that the land would remain hers forever and who had apparently found a way to keep that promise even in death. Knowledge, as they say, can be a dangerous thing. Once the Perron family understood the history of their property, they found themselves viewing every strange occurrence through a very different lens. What had once been mysterious but possibly explainable now carried the weight of a century-old curse. The change in perspective affected each family member differently. Roger, ever the practical businessman, tried to maintain his skepticism despite the mounting evidence. Even if all those stories are true, he told Carolyn during one of their late-night kitchen conversations, that doesn't mean we're dealing with anything supernatural. Old houses have atmospheres. People can sense history in places where traumatic events occurred. It was a reasonable position. the kind of measured response you'd expect from someone trained to analyze problems logically. Unfortunately, logic was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain as the phenomena intensified. Carolyn found herself caught between her rational mind and her growing certainty that something genuinely unnatural was happening in their home. The historical research had provided context for their experiences, but it had also amplified her fears. If Bathsheba Sherman had truly been responsible for the deaths of local children, what might she be capable of doing to the Perron girls? The children themselves adapted with the remarkable flexibility that young minds possess when confronted with the impossible. They developed strategies for dealing with their supernatural housemates, avoiding certain rooms during specific hours, learning to distinguish between friendly spirits like April's Johnny and more threatening presences. "The sad lady in the kitchen isn't mean," 10-year-old Nancy explained to her mother one morning. "She just cries a lot and sometimes moves things around. But the angry lady upstairs, we stay away from her." It was becoming clear that the farmhouse harbored multiple spirits, not just Bathsheba Sherman. The property's long history of tragedy had apparently created what paranormal investigators would later describe as a layered haunting. Different entities from different time periods, all somehow bound to the same location. But Bathsheba's presence seemed to dominate and direct the others, like a malevolent conductor orchestrating a supernatural symphony. As summer progressed, the activity escalated in both frequency and intensity. The missing broom incidents evolved into more dramatic disturbances. Entire rooms would be rearranged overnight, with furniture moved into impossible configurations that would have required several strong adults to accomplish. One morning, Carolyn came downstairs to find every chair in the dining room stacked in a perfect pyramid in the center of the table. The chairs were heavy oak pieces that she struggled to move individually, yet someone or something had lifted them effortlessly and arranged them with mathematical precision. "Did any of you girls do this?" she asked at breakfast, though she already knew the answer. 5 heads shook in unison, their expressions mixing curiosity with unease. Even if they had wanted to create such a display, the children lacked the physical strength to move the furniture alone, and the arrangement would have required considerable time and planning. The smells, too, became more pronounced and varied. The rotting flesh odor that had occasionally appeared now manifested regularly, usually in the late afternoon when the family gathered for dinner. But it was joined by other scents that seemed designed to unsettle rather than simply disgust. The cloying sweetness of funeral flowers, the acrid smoke of burning hair, and, most disturbingly, the unmistakable aroma of a newborn baby, which would drift through the house just long enough for everyone to notice before vanishing completely. Carolyn's unexplained bruises not only continued but became more severe and specific. She began finding handprint marks on her arms and shoulders, as if someone with unusually long, thin fingers had gripped her tightly while she slept. The marks were always perfectly formed, showing clear impressions of individual fingertips and thumb placement. Roger documented these injuries with photographs, thinking they might need medical or even legal evidence if the situation continued to deteriorate. Looking at the images later, he was struck by how deliberate the marks appeared. Not random bruising from restless sleep or accidental bumping, but precise grips that suggested intention and awareness. Perhaps most unsettling was the pattern of when these marks appeared. They invariably showed up after Carolyn had spent time researching the house's history or discussing their experiences with neighbors. It was as if something was punishing her for investigating too deeply into the property's past. The children's encounters with spirits became more complex and interactive. April's friend Johnny began delivering increasingly specific warnings about the angry lady's intentions. According to April, Johnny had lived in the house a very long time ago and had died as a child, though he remained vague about the circumstances of his death. "He says we need to be very careful," April told her parents one evening. "The angry lady is getting stronger, and she's planning something bad. Johnny tries to protect us, but he's not as strong as she is." 12-year-old Andrea began experiencing what could only be described as physical attacks. She would wake in the morning with scratch marks on her back and arms. Long, parallel gouges that looked like claw marks but were too precise to have been made by any animal. The scratches appeared overnight, with no pain or awareness on Andrea's part, as if she had been sedated during the assault. Nancy and Christine reported seeing shadow figures moving through the hallways at night, tall, dark silhouettes that seemed to glide rather than walk. These figures never approached the children directly, but their presence was deeply unsettling, like being watched by predators who were biding their time. Even little Cindy, typically the most cheerful and adaptable of the sisters, began showing signs of strain. She started refusing to play alone in certain parts of the house, insisting that the lady with the scary face was watching her from the corners. Roger's business trips, which had once provided a welcome break from the farmhouse's oppressive atmosphere, became sources of anxiety for both him and the family. Leaving Carolyn alone with the children while supernatural activity was escalating felt irresponsible, but canceling his travel would have meant financial hardship they couldn't afford. During one particularly difficult week in July, while Roger was away on a sales route through New England, the phenomena reached a new level of intensity. Carolyn had just finished putting the younger girls to bed when she heard what sounded like a party in the dining room. Voices, laughter, and music, as if the house were hosting a gathering of invisible guests. She crept downstairs and pressed her ear to the dining room door. The sounds were definitely coming from inside the room. Multiple voices engaged in conversation, though she couldn't make out individual words. There was music too, something that sounded like a fiddle or violin playing a waltz. When she opened the door, the room was empty and silent, but the air was thick with the lingering sense of pipe tobacco and perfume, as if a crowd of people had just vanished moments before her arrival. The dining room table, which she had cleared after dinner, was now set for 12, with plates, silverware, and glasses arranged as if for a formal dinner party. Carolyn stood in the doorway for several minutes, trying to process what she was seeing. The table settings were perfectly arranged, using china and crystal she didn't recognize. Some of the pieces appeared to be antiques, far older and more elaborate than anything the family owned. She called out, hoping one of the girls might have come downstairs and arranged the display as some sort of elaborate prank. But the house remained silent, except for the familiar creaking of old wood settling in the summer heat. That night, Carolyn didn't sleep at all. She sat in the kitchen with a cup of coffee and the phone within reach, listening to the house around her. The sounds continued until dawn. Footsteps in empty rooms, doors opening and closing, and occasionally the soft murmur of voices engaged in conversations she couldn't understand. When Roger returned 2 days later, he found his wife exhausted and shaken. She described the events of his absence, showing him photographs she had taken of the mysteriously set table and documenting the scratches that had appeared on Andrea's arms. This can't continue, she told him. Whatever's happening here, it's getting worse. The girls are starting to have nightmares. Andrea barely sleeps anymore. And I feel like I'm being watched constantly, even in the bathroom, even when I'm alone. Roger looked at the evidence his wife had compiled. Photographs, written accounts of each incident, even audio recordings she had made of the mysterious voices. It was difficult to dismiss such comprehensive documentation, especially when it came from someone as practical and level-headed as Carolyn. "What do you want to do?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "I want to call someone who understands this kind of thing," Carolyn said. "I want to find experts who can tell us what we're dealing with and how to make it stop." Roger nodded slowly. His rational mind rebelled against the idea of contacting ghost hunters or paranormal investigators, but his responsibilities as a husband and father demanded that he take action to protect his family. "Do you know anyone like that?" Carolyn pulled out a newspaper clipping she had been saving, an article about a husband and wife team of paranormal investigators from Connecticut who had gained national attention for their work with haunted houses. The article described them as serious researchers who approached the supernatural with scientific methods, and Christian faith. Their names were Ed and Lorraine Warren. "I think," Carolyn said, "it's time to make a phone call." The decision to contact the Warrens would prove to be a turning point in the Perron family's ordeal, though not necessarily in the way they hoped. In our next chapter, we'll explore the arrival of these famous investigators and their first encounter with the dark forces that had claimed the old Sherman farmhouse. The phone call to Ed and Lorraine Warren took place on a humid Thursday evening in late July. Carolyn had rehearsed what she would say, trying to find a balance between conveying the seriousness of their situation without sounding like someone who had lost touch with reality. She needn't have worried. Within the first few minutes of conversation, it became clear that Lorraine Warren had heard similar stories many times before. "How long have you been living in the house?" Lorraine asked, her voice calm and professional. "About 6 months," Carolyn replied. "The activity started almost immediately, but it's been getting progressively worse." "Has anyone in your family been physically harmed?" Carolyn described the bruises, the scratch marks on Andrea, and the general sense of menace that seemed to pervade the house. Lorraine listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification about specific details. "We'd like to come and assess the situation," Lorraine said finally. "But I want you to understand that our investigation might make things temporarily worse before they get better. Sometimes, entities become more active when they sense they're being studied or challenged." It wasn't exactly the reassurance Carolyn had been hoping for, but at least it was honest. They scheduled a visit for the following weekend when Roger would be home and the entire family could be present. Ed and Lorraine Warren arrived on a Saturday morning in early August, driving a modest sedan that looked decidedly ordinary for people whose profession involved hunting ghosts. Ed was a tall, distinguished man in his 40s with graying hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to taking charge of difficult situations. Lorraine appeared smaller and more delicate, but there was an intensity in her eyes that suggested she saw things others missed. They brought with them an array of equipment that seemed part scientific instrument, part religious artifact. Cameras, tape recorders, and electromagnetic field detectors shared space with crucifixes, holy water, and various other blessed objects. It was an interesting combination of modern technology and ancient faith. "Before we begin," Ed explained to the assembled family, "I want everyone to understand what we do and what we don't do. We're not here to prove or disprove anything. We're here to document what's happening and determine the best course of action to help your family." Lorraine walked through the house slowly, pausing in certain rooms and hallways as if listening to sounds only she could hear. Her husband followed with a camera, documenting everything methodically. The children watched with fascination, having never seen adults take their supernatural experiences so seriously. "There are definitely multiple presences here," Lorraine announced after completing her initial survey. "Some are relatively benign, lost souls who are simply confused about their circumstances. But there's something else, something much stronger and more malevolent." She paused in the kitchen, closing her eyes and remaining motionless for nearly a minute. When she opened them again, her expression was troubled. "There's a woman," she said slowly, "older, filled with rage and possessiveness. She considers this house her domain, and she views your family as intruders. She's particularly focused on you." She added, looking directly at Carolyn, "because you're the mother, the heart of the family unit." It was precisely what April's friend Johnny had been trying to tell them, delivered now by someone with decades of experience in such matters. Ed set up recording equipment in several rooms while Lorraine continued her psychic survey of the property. They worked with quiet efficiency, treating the investigation like any other professional consultation. There was no drama, no theatrical pronouncements, just two experts going about their business with practiced competence. We'll need to stay overnight, Ed informed Roger. Most supernatural activity occurs during the hours of darkness, when the barriers between our world and theirs are thinnest. Unfortunately, their first night in the Sherman farmhouse would prove more eventful than anyone had anticipated. The evening began quietly enough. The Warren team set up monitoring equipment throughout the house, with particular attention to the areas where the family had experienced the most activity. Ed positioned himself in the living room with audio recording equipment, while Lorraine chose to spend the night in the kitchen, where she sensed the strongest psychic impressions. The Perron family tried to maintain their normal bedtime routine, though the presence of investigators in their home made relaxation difficult. The children were excited by the novelty of having ghost hunters as overnight guests, but their parents remained apprehensive about what the night might bring. Around midnight, the activity began. It started with temperature fluctuations, sudden cold spots that moved through the house like invisible storms. The electromagnetic field detectors began registering anomalous readings, their needles dancing wildly before settling back to normal levels. Then came the sounds. Footsteps echoed through the upstairs hallway, heavy and deliberate, as if someone were pacing back and forth in agitation. Doors began opening and closing with increasing frequency, the sounds sharp and purposeful in the midnight stillness. Ed's recording equipment captured it all. Every footstep, every door slam, every whispered voice that drifted through the darkness. But what the machines couldn't record was the growing sense of presence that filled the house, the feeling that something ancient and angry was awakening to the intrusion of strangers. Lorraine, sitting quietly in the kitchen with her eyes closed, began to speak in a voice barely above a whisper. "She's here," she said. "She's very angry about our presence. She's trying to frighten us away." The temperature in the kitchen dropped 20 degrees in less than a minute. Lorraine's breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air, but she remained motionless, apparently communicating with whatever presence had manifested around her. "She says this is her house," Lorraine continued, her voice taking on a strange, distant quality. "She says we have no right to be here, that the family has no right to be here. She wants everyone to leave." Ed appeared in the kitchen doorway, camera in hand. He began photographing the area around his wife, though to the naked eye she appeared to be sitting alone at the table. "Bathsheba," Lorraine said suddenly, and the temperature dropped another 10 degrees. "Your name is Bathsheba Sherman. You died in 1885, and you've been bound to this property ever since." The response was immediate and violent. Every cabinet door in the kitchen flew open simultaneously. Dishes rattled on their shelves. The overhead light fixture swayed as if caught in a strong wind, though the air in the room remained perfectly still. From upstairs came the sound of running footsteps and children's voices calling for their parents. The Perron girls had been awakened by what Andrea later described as the angriest voice I've ever heard, screaming through the house. Roger rushed upstairs to check on his daughters, while Carolyn remained in the kitchen with the Warrens, watching in fascination and terror as the supernatural tantrum continued around them. "She doesn't want to be named," Lorraine observed with remarkable calm, considering that kitchen utensils were now flying out of drawers and clattering to the floor around her. Acknowledgement gives her less power to hide and more obligation to respond. The activity reached a crescendo when the large oak table in the center of the kitchen began to vibrate, its heavy wooden frame shaking as if an earthquake were occurring directly beneath it. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, everything stopped. The silence that followed was profound and somehow more unsettling than the chaos that had preceded it. The kitchen remained frigid, but the violent displays ceased entirely, leaving behind only scattered utensils and the lingering sense that they were being watched by something utterly hostile. "She's withdrawn for now," Lorraine said, finally opening her eyes. "But this was just a warning. She wanted us to understand what she's capable of when she chooses to manifest fully." Ed lowered his camera and surveyed the damaged kitchen with professional detachment. "We've documented extensive paranormal activity," he told Carolyn. This is definitely a case that requires intervention. But what type of intervention, and whether it would ultimately help or harm the family, remained to be seen. The Warrens spent the rest of the night reviewing their recordings and photographs, finding clear evidence of supernatural phenomena that would have convinced even determined skeptics. Voices appeared on the audio recordings that no one had heard with their naked ears. Photographs showed mysterious lights and shadows that hadn't been visible during the actual events. Most disturbing of all were the images Ed had taken during Lorraine's communication with Bathsheba. Several photographs showed what appeared to be a dark, vaguely human shape looming behind Lorraine's chair, though nothing had been visible to anyone in the room at the time. "What happens now?" Roger asked as the investigators packed their equipment the following morning. "Now," Ed said grimly, "we determine the best way to help your family reclaim your home. But I want you to understand that dealing with an entity this powerful and entrenched won't be simple or risk-free." He paused, looking around the kitchen where evidence of the night's supernatural violence still lingered. "Some battles," he added quietly, "come with casualties on both sides." The Warrens' assessment would lead to a plan of action that none of them fully anticipated, involving methods that would test not only their courage, but their faith in the face of an enemy that had been growing stronger for nearly a century. What happened next would become one of the most controversial and frightening episodes in the Warrens' long career. 3 weeks passed before the Warrens returned to the Sherman farmhouse, and they were 3 of the most difficult weeks the Perron family had yet endured. It was as if Bathsheba's confrontation with the investigators had awakened something that had previously been content to merely harass and intimidate. Now, she seemed determined to wage war. The kitchen bore the brunt of her fury. Dishes would explode without warning, sending ceramic shards across the room. The refrigerator door would slam open and closed repeatedly throughout the night, its hinges groaning in protest. Most unsettling of all, the kitchen table, the same heavy oak piece that had vibrated during the Warrens' visit, would be found each morning arranged for a meal, complete with place settings for people who had been dead for decades. Carolyn stopped cooking entirely, too frightened to spend any extended time in the room where Bathsheba's presence felt strongest. The family began eating simple meals prepared in the living room, huddled together like refugees in their own home. The children's experiences intensified as well. Andrea's mysterious scratches became daily occurrences, appearing in increasingly elaborate patterns across her back and arms. Nancy reported that shadow figures now followed her through the hallways, maintaining a constant presence just at the edge of her vision. Even little April's friendly spirit, Johnny, seemed to be struggling against whatever malevolent force was growing stronger within the house. "Johnny says he's trying to protect us," April told her parents one morning. "But the angry lady is getting too strong. He says we might need to go away for a while." It was advice that Roger was seriously considering. The family's savings could support a temporary relocation, perhaps a rental house in town while they decided whether to sell the farmhouse and start over elsewhere. But Carolyn refused to consider abandoning their home. "If we run now," she argued, "we'll never know if this could have been resolved. And what about the next family who buys this place? Do we just let them walk into the same nightmare we've been living?" It was a principled position, though Roger sometimes wondered if his wife's determination stemmed more from stubbornness than nobility. Carolyn had invested so much of herself in making the farmhouse into their family home that admitting defeat felt like a personal failure she couldn't accept. When the Warrens returned in late August, they brought with them additional equipment and a plan that made Roger deeply uncomfortable. "We believe the only way to resolve this situation permanently is through direct spiritual confrontation," Ed explained during their planning meeting. "Bathsheba Sherman has attached herself to this property so completely that standard cleansing rituals won't be sufficient. We need to force her to acknowledge that she no longer belongs here." Lorraine spread out what appeared to be architectural drawings of the house, marked with notations in her careful handwriting. "The spiritual energy is strongest in the kitchen and the basement," she said. These were the areas where Bathsheba spent most of her time in life, and they remain her primary anchors to this plane of existence. The plan they outlined involved conducting a séance in the kitchen, using Lorraine as a medium to communicate directly with Bathsheba's spirit. The goal was to convince her to move on to whatever afterlife awaited her, freeing the property from her influence. "What if she refuses?" Roger asked. "Then we attempt a more forceful banishment," Ed replied. "But that carries significant risks, both for your family and for us." He didn't elaborate on what those risks might be, but his expression suggested they were considerable. The séance was scheduled for the following Saturday evening, during what the Warrens described as a particularly favorable alignment of spiritual energies. Roger remained skeptical about such concepts, but he had learned to trust the investigator's expertise in matters beyond his understanding. The children would stay overnight with neighbors, removing them from whatever confrontation might occur. Only the adults would be present: the Warrens, Roger, Carolyn, and a local minister whom Ed had requested to provide additional spiritual support. Father Gordon Braun was an elderly Catholic priest who had known the Warren family for many years. He arrived an hour before the scheduled séance, carrying a worn leather satchel that contained what he described as tools for spiritual warfare. The priest's matter-of-fact approach to supernatural combat was somehow both reassuring and terrifying. "I've assisted the Warrens in similar situations," he told Roger while they prepared the kitchen. "Most entities respond to firm spiritual authority, but occasionally we encounter something that requires more aggressive intervention." The séance began at precisely 9 p.m., with the participants seated around the kitchen table that had been the focus of so much supernatural activity. Candles provided the only illumination, casting dancing shadows on the walls that seemed to move independently of the flickering flames. Lorraine sat at the head of the table, her hands placed flat on the wooden surface, her eyes closed in concentration. Ed positioned himself to her right with recording equipment, while Father Braun sat to her left with his Bible and various blessed objects. Roger and Carolyn faced each other across the table, uncertain what to expect, but committed to seeing the process through. For nearly 10 minutes, nothing happened. The kitchen remained quiet except for the soft whisper of wind through the old window frames and the occasional creak of settling wood. Then Lorraine began to speak in a voice that was recognizably hers, but somehow different, flatter, more distant, as if she were speaking from a great depth. "There is someone here," she said without opening her eyes. "Someone who has been waiting a very long time." The temperature in the room began to drop, but gradually this time, like the slow approach of winter rather than the sudden freeze they had experienced during the Warrens' first visit. "She's angry," Lorraine continued. "So angry. She feels betrayed, abandoned, forgotten." "Bathsheba," Father Braun said quietly, "if you are present, know that you are speaking with servants of God who wish only to help you find peace." The response was immediate and unmistakable. Every candle in the room flickered simultaneously, their flames bending as if struck by a sudden wind. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees, and the scent of rotting flowers filled the air. "She doesn't want peace," Lorraine said, and now her voice carried an edge that hadn't been there before. "She wants possession. She wants control. She wants this family gone so she can reclaim what she believes is rightfully hers." Ed leaned forward with his recorder, documenting every word while Father Braun began reciting prayers in Latin. The priest's voice was steady and authoritative, but Roger could see tension in his shoulders that suggested he was preparing for a more serious confrontation. "Bathsheba Sherman," Father Braun said, switching back to English. "You died in 1885. Your earthly life has ended and your time in this realm has passed. In the name of Jesus Christ, I command you to release your hold on this property and these people. What happened next would be burned into the memory of everyone present for the rest of their lives. Lorraine's eyes snapped open, but they were no longer her eyes. The gentle brown irises had been replaced by something dark and malevolent that seemed to look directly through the people around the table and into their souls. When she spoke, it was with a voice that belonged to someone else entirely, someone filled with decades of accumulated rage and hatred. "This is my house," the voice hissed through Lorraine's lips. "Mine! I will not be cast out by strangers who have no right to be here. The woman thinks she can replace me, thinks she can be the mother in my home. I will show her what happens to those who try to steal from Bathsheba Sherman." The kitchen erupted into chaos. Cabinet doors flew open with explosive force, sending dishes crashing to the floor. The overhead light fixture began swinging in wide, violent arcs. The table itself started to shake so violently that the participants had to grip its edges to avoid being thrown from their chairs. But most terrifying of all was what was happening to Lorraine. The medium's body began to convulse as if she were having a seizure, but her eyes remained fixed on Carolyn with predatory intensity. Her hands, still pressed flat against the table, started to claw at the wooden surface, leaving deep scratches in the antique oak. "Lorraine," Ed called out, reaching for his wife, but Father Braun grabbed his arm. "Don't touch her," the priest commanded. "She's fully possessed. Physical contact could trap you as well." Father Braun began reciting an exorcism prayer, his voice rising to compete with the supernatural cacophony filling the kitchen. But the entity speaking through Lorraine only laughed, a sound like breaking glass that seemed to come from everywhere at once. "Your God has no power here, priest," Bathsheba's voice sneered. "This land was consecrated to older powers long before your Christ walked the earth. I have made my pact, and it cannot be broken." The violence escalated. Kitchen knives began flying from their magnetic strip on the wall, embedding themselves in the wooden cabinets with deadly force. One blade missed Roger's head by inches, burying itself in the wall behind him. Carolyn tried to stand, perhaps to flee the room, but invisible hands seemed to push her back into her chair. "She can't leave," Lorraine Bathsheba announced with satisfaction. "None of you can leave until I have finished what I started." The possessed medium's attention fixed on Carolyn with laser focus. "You think you can be the mother here? You think you can raise your children in my house? I will show you what I do to mothers who trespass on my domain." Lorraine's body began to rise from her chair, not standing but levitating, suspended several inches above the seat, her head tilted at an unnatural angle. And when she spoke again, her voice had become something inhuman. "I killed them all," she whispered, and the room fell silent except for the priest's continued prayers. "Every child who lived on my land, every mother who thought she could replace me. I drained the life from them, slowly, deliciously, and I will do the same to you and yours." Father Braun's voice rose to a shout as he commanded the entity to release its hold on Lorraine and depart from the house. But Bathsheba's grip seemed to be tightening rather than loosening, and the medium's physical condition was becoming alarming. Blood began to trickle from Lorraine's nose and ears. Her breathing became labored and irregular. Most frightening of all, her skin was taking on a grayish pallor that suggested whatever was possessing her was literally draining her life force. "We have to stop this," Ed said desperately. "She's going to kill Lorraine." But the séance had gone far beyond their ability to control, and the entity that had once been Bathsheba Sherman was just getting started. For several agonizing moments, it seemed as though Bathsheba Sherman might actually succeed in claiming Lorraine Warren's life as the ultimate victory in her century-long war for possession of the farmhouse. The medium's body hung suspended in the air, defying gravity, while something ancient and malevolent spoke through her lips with increasing venom. Father Braun's prayers grew more urgent, his voice hoarse from shouting Latin phrases over the supernatural chaos that had transformed the kitchen into a battlefield. Ed Warren struggled against invisible forces that seemed determined to prevent him from reaching his wife, while Roger and Carolyn watched in horror as the confrontation spiraled beyond anyone's control. But then, something unexpected happened. A small voice cut through the mayhem, clear, young, and absolutely fearless. "Stop hurting the nice lady." Everyone in the room turned toward the kitchen doorway, where 5-year-old April Perron stood in her pajamas, having apparently slipped away from the neighbor's house and made her way home. Her presence should have been terrifying given the violence occurring around her, but the child seemed remarkably calm as she addressed the chaos with the directness that only children possess. "You're being mean to everyone," April continued, speaking to the empty air as if addressing a visible person. "Johnny says you need to go away now. You're not supposed to be here anymore." The effect was immediate and startling. The flying kitchen utensils dropped to the floor with metallic crashes. The swinging light fixture slowed its violent arc. Most significantly, Lorraine's levitating body began to descend back toward her chair, though her eyes remained that unsettling black void. "Johnny says you're just sad and angry because nobody remembers you," April said, taking several steps into the room with the fearless confidence of childhood. "But that doesn't mean you can hurt people. That's not nice." When Bathsheba's voice emerged from Lorraine's throat this time, it carried a different quality. Confusion rather than rage, as if the entity was struggling to understand how a 5-year-old child could address her so directly. "The child sees," the voice whispered. "She sees the boy." "How does she see the boy?" Father Braun, recognizing an opportunity in this moment of supernatural uncertainty, intensified his prayers while Ed managed to reach Lorraine's side. The medium's physical condition remained alarming. Blood still trickled from her nose, and her breathing was shallow and irregular, but the violent convulsions had stopped. "Johnny's been trying to protect us from you," April explained with the patience of someone talking to a particularly difficult adult. "He says you used to live here a long time ago, but you died, and now you need to go to where dead people are supposed to go." She paused, tilting her head as if listening to something only she could hear. "He says you're scared about going to the place where dead people go, but it's not scary. It's just different. And you can't stay here forever because this isn't your house anymore." The temperature in the room began to normalize, and the oppressive atmosphere that had made breathing difficult started to lift. But Lorraine remained possessed, her consciousness apparently trapped somewhere, while Bathsheba and the child spirit called Johnny engaged in negotiations that none of the adults fully understood. "The boy, he died here too," Bathsheba's voice said through Lorraine, but now it sounded more like a conversation than a threat. "He died because of me. I made him sick like I made the others sick." "He forgives you," April said simply. "He says everybody makes mistakes, even dead people. But you have to stop making mistakes now and go where you're supposed to go." Ed had positioned himself behind Lorraine's chair, ready to catch her if she collapsed, while Father Braun continued his prayers in a softer voice. Roger and Carolyn remained frozen, afraid that any movement might shatter whatever delicate negotiation was taking place between their youngest daughter and forces they couldn't see or understand. "I don't want to go alone," Bathsheba's voice admitted, and for the first time since the possession had begun, there was vulnerability rather than anger in the words. "I've been alone here for so long. So very long." "You won't be alone," April assured her. "Johnny says there are lots of people there, and they'll help you learn how to be dead properly. He says it's actually much nicer than being stuck in a house all the time. The transformation in Lorraine's appearance was gradual, but unmistakable. The unnatural pallor began to fade from her skin. Her breathing became more regular. Most importantly, her eyes slowly returned to their normal brown color, though she remained unconscious. Will you tell them I'm sorry? Bathsheba asked through the medium's lips, and now the voice carried genuine remorse. Tell them I'm sorry for hurting the children. I was just so angry, so jealous of the mothers who could have what I never had. I'll tell them, April promised solemnly. But you have to promise to go away now and not come back. You have to promise not to hurt any more families. There was a long pause, during which the only sounds were Father Braun's continued prayers and the settling of the old house around them. Then Bathsheba's voice spoke one final time through Lorraine Warren. I promise. I'm ready to go now. What happened next defied easy description. The air in the kitchen seemed to shimmer, like heat waves rising from summer pavement. A subtle but unmistakable sense of movement filled the room, as if something large and heavy were departing through invisible doors. The oppressive atmosphere that had characterized the farmhouse for months simply lifted. Lorraine's eyes fluttered open and she looked around the devastated kitchen with confusion and exhaustion. Did it work? She asked weakly. It worked, Ed replied, helping his wife sit up straight in her chair. Though not exactly the way we planned. April walked over to where her parents sat in stunned silence and climbed onto Carolyn's lap. Johnny says goodbye, she announced. He says he's going with the angry lady to make sure she gets to the right place and doesn't get lost again. And with that simple statement, the haunting of the Sherman farmhouse came to an end. In the days that followed, the transformation in the house was unmistakable. The oppressive atmosphere that had made every room feel watched and unwelcoming simply vanished. The unexplained cold spots disappeared. The mysterious sounds stopped entirely. Even Sadie, the family dog who had refused to enter the house for 8 months, finally crossed the threshold and made herself comfortable by the fireplace. The Warrens returned several times over the following weeks to document the resolution and ensure that no residual supernatural activity remained. Their equipment registered normal readings throughout the house. Lorraine's psychic impressions detected no hostile presences. Most convincingly, the family's daily life returned to the ordinary rhythms of normal domestic existence. The scratches on Andrea's arms healed and never returned. Nancy's shadow figures disappeared entirely. Christine stopped finding her belongings rearranged by invisible hands. The kitchen became simply a kitchen again, rather than a supernatural battlefield. But perhaps the most significant change was in Carolyn herself. The mysterious bruises that had appeared with such regularity during the haunting never manifested again. She slept peacefully through the night. Most importantly, she felt safe in her own home for the first time since they had moved to the farmhouse. The Perron family would remain in the Sherman farmhouse for several more years, raising their daughters in what had become a genuinely peaceful rural environment. The property that had once been known locally as a place of tragedy and supernatural danger became simply another working farm, notable only for its historical architecture and picturesque setting. Years later, when journalists and paranormal researchers asked the family about their experiences, they would always credit April's courage and Johnny's intervention for the successful resolution. But they would also acknowledge that without the Warrens' investigation and Father Braun's spiritual support, the confrontation might have ended very differently. Ed Warren would later describe the case as one of the most challenging of his career, not because of the supernatural phenomena involved, but because it required him to trust a 5-year-old child's judgment about how to handle forces that had defeated adult intervention for nearly a century. Sometimes, he would reflect in interviews, the most powerful spiritual weapons are innocence and compassion. April saw what we adults missed, that Bathsheba Sherman wasn't just an evil entity to be banished, but a troubled soul who needed guidance to find peace. Lorraine Warren recovered fully from her possession experience, though she would always remember the sensation of being displaced from her own consciousness while something else controlled her body. She credited April's intervention with saving not only her life, but possibly her soul. That child, she would say years later, had the kind of faith that moves mountains, or in this case, the kind of faith that moves ghosts. The farmhouse still stands today, occupied by families who sleep peacefully through quiet nights. Visitors who know its history sometimes comment on the sense of peace that pervades the property, a feeling of resolution and contentment that suggests old wounds have finally healed. And sometimes on warm summer evenings when the light slants golden through the old oak tree behind the house, neighbors report seeing two small figures playing together in the yard, a little girl and a boy, in old-fashioned clothes, laughing as they chase each other through the grass before fading away like mist in the twilight. Whether these are spirits or simply tricks of light and shadow, no one can say for certain. But the sightings are always peaceful, suggesting that Johnny kept his promise to help Bathsheba find her way, and that both of them finally discovered what had eluded them in life: the simple joy of innocent friendship, unmarked by anger, jealousy, or fear. Some stories end with victory over evil, others end with evil transformed into something better, and sometimes, if we're very fortunate, they end with the understanding that redemption is possible even for those who seem lost beyond hope. The Perron family learned that their farmhouse had been home to tragedy for over a century, but they also learned that with courage, compassion, and the wisdom that sometimes comes through the voices of children, even the darkest histories can be healed. And in the end, that may be the most supernatural miracle of all.